It turns out that I have a few things in common with Tim. Tim comes from Oxford, hails from Oxford. I spent about a year there. He also is interested in the domain of statistics and numeracy and literacy with data. Those are things that I'm quite interested in. He has a podcast with 1 million people. I've got a podcast with a few thousand people listening to it, so still working on it. But we're both interested in this concept, right, of how to get people to think with data. And I think when Tim writes about it, he's writing about it on an individual basis. And he's thinking about how do we think about getting people individually to combat these ideas of sort of ignorance and confirmation bias and quite possibly just inattention altogether, right? But that's something that also exists at an organizational level. And so the reason why I hope all of us are here is because we want to be able to combat within our organizations those phenomena happening as a group. We'd like to be able to look at the people in the organizations and talk to them and have them all come to conclusions that are science-based, that are on the side of right. And this idea of building a data culture really is all about that, right? How do we get groups of people to think a little bit more logically? How do we get groups of people to think about science in making decisions and coming to conclusions? And so I would encourage you to listen to the podcast. And a lot of the things that I'm talking about actually have a lot of exposition with many of the guests who show up. Folks, frankly, like Tim, who think a lot about science and numbers and how to get other people to think rationally. Now, a little bit less about me and a little bit more about Alation. You may have seen in our social media news that we recently announced that we are a centaur, which is a play on the word ARR, which stands for annual recurring revenue, and cent, of course, which is the Latin root for 100. And so in this case, we have $100 million of ARR, and why that really matters for you is because you can expect that this company will be around for a reasonably long period of time. And why it really matters in the world of technology is because most technology companies follow, and the successful ones follow, a power law distribution. Basically, what you find is that as companies scale and grow, they get more revenue. And as those companies that are successful in the lead categories get more and more revenue, the flip happens, which is those same companies invest in R&D as a consequence of it. So the product actually gets better at an accelerating pace. And that's exactly what we're trying to do here at Alation. And we're, interestingly and not surprising, with the power law distribution growing faster. There's increasing returns to scale to the technology that we're building. And we got to this place by basically leading a subcategory within the category that I'm talking today. So the title of the presentation is our vision for data intelligence. And by vision, I don't really sort of want to talk about this sort of far off future place, but rather our vision in terms of seeing the category as it exists right now and how we think it's going to evolve. And so we started in this subcategory. We actually started the subcategory of what's called data cataloging. 10 years ago, when we started the company, the closest cousin to this category was this thing called metadata management. How many of you have heard about this idea of metadata management? Is this some few, yeah. So the category of metadata management, when I describe it, often, one can use an analogy. And so if you think about Amazon.com, Amazon.com has thousands of distribution centers. And those distribution centers has people and perhaps, in some cases, robots working inside of them. And in these distribution centers, people have to move boxes around. And they have to move the boxes from shelves to trucks, from trucks to shelves. And the folks and the robots inside of those campuses need to know exactly how to move those things around. And that's how I basically describe metadata management software. You have a data warehouse, you might have a data lake. You need to know where to move the things. You don't necessarily need to know what's inside the box. You just need to know how to move those things around, right? Now, there is that same software that's inside of the warehouse, but of course, nobody could ever shop using that inventory management software. Nobody could actually buy anything off of Amazon.com using that software. And so this data cataloging category had what was kind of a basic and fundamental and not seemingly somewhat obvious premise, which was to shop for data, you need to have a lot of context. You need to understand a lot of the information about what it is that you happen to be buying. And you need to be able to search for it. And so we started this category 10 years ago, and I think most third parties say that we're the leader. And as things change, as things evolve, right? so too do software categories. And what I'm going to talk to you about is this broader category of data intelligence, which we think is going to exist today. Now, Tim talked about things that I talk quite a bit about, which is this idea of curiosity, right? If you think about this idea of shopping for information, you have to want to buy something. And the act of buying means that you're curious about some problem that you want to solve in your life. There's this good or this product or this service, and these goods and these products and these services all have this opportunity to help you in some particular way. It has an opportunity to basically change your life for the better because you're trying to learn about some problem. And that's true for things that you're buying. That's true for problems that you're solving in your everyday life. And that's true for problems that you have in your business. And so this idea of curiosity, I think, can be super powerful in the context of building a business or solving problems within your business or solving problems for your business. And in some sense, innovation, all innovation, starts with this seed, this kernel, this like nurture of this idea that I can make the world better. And so I'm going to innovate, I'm going to change the world, and I'm curious about how I might start to do that. And so this idea of curiosity is really, really important because it is the seed of change. If you're able to be curious about something, then you're able to possibly think about different ways in which that can evolve. And if you're rational, I would argue that's going to encompass the two other things that we're talking about. This idea of being calm, right? This idea of not being excited about any particular feeling that you might have, but rather following the trail of logic and data and reasoning to be able to get to a solution. And so what we want to try to do here at Alation is basically empower those two ideas. How do people think about problems, approach them with a clear mind, and act on them in a rational way, right? That's what we're trying to do. I would argue that's probably, hopefully, what you're trying to do within your organizations as well. So now, to do all of this, right, you have to do this curiosity thing, you of course want this thing called data. And most of you in all of your organizations have a lot of data. And to use this data, you need to be able to, as Tim told us, contextualize it. And there are so many different questions that every one of our organizations have about data, or that data can be answered through. Can I trust the data? Is the data private? What policies are associated with my data? Who knows how to use this data? How do we enable people to be more data literate? These are yet some of the questions. There are probably an infinite number of questions that you have theoretically about your data in order to be able to use it, right? And so that's exactly where this category comes into play. So how many people have heard this term data intelligence? Is this a popular term? Some folks, right? Okay, I think you're going to be hearing more and more about it over time. Because what data intelligence is, broadly, is a software category. It's not some state of being. Like, I've had people come up to me and say, well, Satyen, you sell software and data intelligence. How do I become more data intelligent? That's like not a thing that you aspire to. It's not a thing. It's not a state. There's no data intelligence maturity model. It's a category of software, right, that basically outlines all of the possible things that can help you learn about your data. So it helps you contextualize your data. What is the right data to the right person at the right time for the right purpose? And so this software category is one that I would argue in the data domain is probably growing differentially faster and larger than perhaps many of the other software categories that you see in data. There are data platforms, right? There are business intelligence tools. There are artificial intelligence tools. I would argue that most of you and most of your organizations are going to spend most of your time in the coming years investing in this category of data intelligence. And the reason why is quite simple. Because if you think about the work that every single one of you do in order to make data more consumable, most of it is about gathering information about your data, either systemically or tribally through your organizations. But most of the time that you all are spending is basically about gathering all this information, all this context. And to do it at scale means you're going to need way more tools, and you're going to therefore spend a lot more money doing this. And so what I think this topic is very important for each of you is as you think about all of the different vendor marketing, all of the different case studies, all of the different information you're going to see about this market and about this space, what I'm going to try to do in this talk is give you a mental frame for how to think about buying in this space, why the space matters, and how to contextualize the different messages that you're going to hear. And I'll just reveal that I might be a little biased. So you can take that for what it is. So lots of different examples for the software types within this data intelligence category. Some that you obviously would have heard of are data cataloging, but others are things like data governance and self-service analytics and cloud transformation and the old favorite, master data management, and things like data quality, and a new category called data observability. Lots of different categories of software. Lots of them have overlap. Lots of them have, on some sense, might be the same name for two sides of the same thing. And so you're going to try to learn a lot about your data. You're going to try to buy a lot of software in order to be able to do that. Now, why this category matters is because there are so many different trends going on in data. And I want to talk to you about these trends as a little bit of a detour in order for you to understand why this category is going to grow significantly faster over time. So there's 4 trends. I'm going to go through each of them. I would like a show of hands to understand how many people have seen these trends. So data mesh. Is this something that people are? Yeah, I think this is the most popular trend in data as well. And I think, frankly, for good reason. Modern data stack. Has anybody heard of the modern data stack? OK, less people, thank God. I'll get to why I think that is in just a second. Data fabric, okay, and data ops. Okay, more on the data ops side and more on the data mesh side, which is what I basically expected. So let's look at these trends for just a second. So data mesh is basically an architectural framework to deliver data as a product, right? So it was first written about by a woman named Satyen Sangani. She was a consultant, or is a consultant, actually was a consultant at a practice called ThoughtWorks, now is off to actually building her own company. And she basically said, look, data's, I go to all these companies, and I see them trying to centralize all of this data, and I see them try to control all of this data. And it seems to me to basically be a fool's errand. Because every time people try to control all of this data, what they find is whatever control mechanisms they put into place are basically tomorrow already expired. And so why isn't it not the case that the people that are closest to the data are delivering the data they know about, right? We should have data delivered as a product. And so we should create this mesh of data in contrast with the traditional things called a data lake and a data warehouse, right? So she came along and basically said we need to let data be free and let the owners of the data, in some sense, operate as if they were in a virtual marketplace to allow lots of people to use and deliver data. So this is the concept of a data mesh. I think it's a profoundly interesting and important insight, and I'll come back to it in just a bit. The next idea is this idea of the modern data stack. Now, people have increasingly been talking about the modern data stack probably over the last 2 or 3 years, and in particular venture capitalists, because venture capitalists really care to promote the companies that they are investing in. And so the best way to be able to do that is to be able to say, well, I have this company, it's modern. And so there are lots of them that are in the modern data stack, and if you're a company that is in the data space, you're going to tell everybody that you're a part of the modern data stack. And I laugh a little bit and I snicker because what's funny about the modern data stack is there's been a version of the modern data stack pretty much every year that I've been in the software industry, right? There's new companies with new tools and new ideas. And if data software is about nothing else, it's about systematizing human thought. And humans think in a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of underlying technology architectures that exist. But what you can say about the modern data stack, the one conclusion you can reach, is there are so many different tools out there, and there are new and new tools being born every single day. And then there's this thing called the data fabric, and this is offered primarily by Gartner, right? So Gartner being probably the leading advisory firm in the software buying space, basically said, look, you've got all of these tools. They don't really use the word modern data stack, but they say you have all these tools. We're going to give you a reference architecture for how to make all of these tools fit together. And you should use this reference architecture to basically have one of each of these types of tools, and we will give you some secret sauce in terms of thinking about how to knit each of these different software products together and how they should all speak to each other. And that is basically a data fabric. So it's a much more prescriptive architecture for taking all of these tools and putting them together. And you should know that you have one of each of these types of different tools. And the last is this thing called data ops. And data ops is, I think, very interesting because it basically takes a lot of the principles from software development, right, where we used to hear about things like waterfall development. You'd get a big set of requirements. You would then think about all of the technical possibilities for those requirements. You'd design an architecture, and then you'd spend 6 months writing code and software. That was traditionally how software is developed. Not surprising, that was also traditionally how data warehouses and large-scale data marts were developed. You would basically spend a lot of time, you'd got a whole bunch of requirements, you'd figure out what metrics and reports you'd want to deliver on, you'd figure out what your source systems are, and you'd develop a whole bunch of schemas in order to be able to populate data into a warehouse, with the assumption that that never really changed. Data ops, just like in the case of DevOps, right, basically came along and said, look, actually there's a lot more fluidity, and there's a lot more constant change, and your data environment needs to be a lot more agile. And therefore, we need this concept of data ops to allow for data teams, for ETL teams, for IT teams who are in the business of delivering data to be able to deliver data more efficiently and faster. Okay. So you've got these 4 different trends, and I've given you literally the oversimplification world tour of them, but it at least gives you some frame as to how to think about them. And what I'm going to tell you, what I'm going to argue for you, is that all of these things are really kind of part of a broader set of phenomena that are pushing them forward. If we think about data ops, that's all about the massive variety and also the massive velocity of change within our data infrastructures. Modern data stack's about a Cambrian explosion of tools. The fact that you've got a distributed workforce and that you've got distributed data means that centralizing all of this data and this information is really a lost cause. It's something that you just really can't follow. And then you've got, of course, all of these inconsistent regulations, inconsistent ways for all of these systems to talk to each other. So this premise of data fabric is really all about trying to drive some level of constancy and some level of consistency. But the central theme around all of these things is you've just got decentralization. And in some sense, that decentralization was always there. But your data's all over the place. Your applications are all over the place. Your people are all over the place. So you've got this spread of information and knowledge that is just constant and inexorable and impossible to contend with. And so this idea that you're going to centralize all of the knowledge in your company, to centralize all the information in your company, centralize everything that everybody seems to know, is kind of a fool's errand, right? You should stop it. You should realize that all of these trends are bigger than really any of us as individuals, or even any of our individual companies, or any single software company. And so, you'd say, well, I'm here at this Alation conference. I've looked into this category. What you're telling me, Satyen, makes a lot of sense. But I just want to, challenge that thinking a little bit. Like, if you think about your architectures, if you think about the mindset of many of your business stakeholders, people still talk about this idea of a single source of truth. I hear it to this very day. I want to build a single source of truth for X. I want to have all of my X in one single place. And we think that we're going to come up with a world that looks like this. And the reality, of course, is even if you try to build that, no matter how quickly you build that, really there's more outside of the box than there is inside of the box, right? There's all of this change. There's all of these different assets that live everywhere, and you're trying to contend with controlling it. And of course, you can't. And so I guess the argument that I would make for you, and basically the reason that I would ask you to think about this category of data intelligence, is because historically, people have tried to centralize the wrong things. People have tried to centralize the data. People have tried to centralize the code. People have tried to centralize the infrastructure. People have tried to centralize the actual people into individual groups. And Steve, who's going to come up and talk from the Very Group, actually talks a lot about this idea of trying to centralize all of the knowledge within an organization with some really innovative models for how to actually fight that particular trend. But there's this idea of what we want to centralize because we want to control all the mass and matter within this organization relative to now what we realize, or we should be realizing, that we need to centralize, right? Which is basically all of the metadata, the governance apparatus, how people find things and where do they go to find things, and how things relate to each other and how things are defined. Those are the things that we ought to be centralizing. That is what this category called data intelligence actually does. And so as you think about this category, right, that sort of exists, in some sense, the reason for this growth of this category is not necessarily because the software is getting worse in the data platforms market, or it's getting worse in the BI market, or it's getting worse in the data intelligence market. It's because in the same way that you've got so many different types of tools, the ways of organizing these tools is changing quite a bit. There's a different model for how to contend with all of the chaos that all of the data and all of the people and all the application systems are causing within your organization, and that is why this category of data intelligence exists. So this category exists, and I'm going to tell you that my main message now is actually for you to centralize all of your DI tools. And of course, you're here with Alation, so you should just buy Alation, right? That's the message. That's really not the message. Please don't do that. Please don't try to buy one of every single thing and call it a DI platform and say, guess what? I've checked every single box. I'm now done. I've centralized all of my tools in one particular place. That would be a really silly thing to do. And then we'll be talking about you and making fun of you the next time we come up here in a year. So I'm going to make two arguments to you as to how to think about this category in this space, because I think it's going to be quite confusing, and you're going to see lots and lots of innovation in it for years to come, hopefully some from Alation, but certainly from many other vendors. The first thing I would argue is that as you think about this category in this space, going back to the slide that I just presented, what you really want to do is to centralize what needs to be centralized. Think about the things in your organization where you absolutely have to drive commonality, right? These artifacts of metadata, these artifacts of semantics. Use the platform in order to be able to drive commonality in those particular areas, right? The tools don't necessarily all need to be in the same place because they're not necessarily all being used by the same people. Very few people in your organization are going to actually use a master data management tool. Very few people in your organization are going to use a data migration tool. And so if you think about that, then don't try to glom on to one single platform of software all of the capabilities that you might need. Have in a single place the things that need to be common. Okay? So that's the first argument, and hopefully not super debatable. But the other thing that I would argue is that for a data intelligence system to be successful, it has to be nothing else if not connected, engaged, and adopted with, right? And so what you need to make sure of is that ultimately the thing that you think of, ultimately the platform that you invest in, where you bolt on all of these different capabilities over time, connect to everything within your landscape that's important, that's relevant, that's useful. Because if it's not connected, you're not going to be able to gather in all of the appropriate information. And the other thing that I would argue is that it would need to be engaged and adopted by substantially everybody within the organization. Because to the extent that you're going to counter bias, to the extent that you're going to amalgamate knowledge, you want to be able to gather all of the people with that knowledge into a single place. So the systems have knowledge, the people have knowledge. What you want to do is make sure that both of those things are being gathered and consistently brought together over time. And so that's not surprisingly where we're going to be investing. If you listen to Raj's talk later on today, Raj is our Chief Product Officer, and he's going to tell you a lot about how we're investing in connectivity. And one of the things that we're doing in connecting to things is building an open connector platform. So we can connect to all of the things that we deliver out of the box, but we can also connect to anything that you'd like to connect to because you have the ability to develop these connectors arbitrarily and easily and simply, either directly or through an SI, however you might want to do that. That's an area that we're going to be investing in significantly. Now, we've also launched not just sort of connectivity, but also depth of connectivity. So there's this new space called data observability. And within it, there's a lot of data quality vendors. And all of these folks that are on this particular slide, Soda being one example who's here and sponsoring today, are companies that basically are trying to measure data quality. And there are different ways to measure data quality. And some functions within your business might want to measure it one way. Other functions within your business might want to do it slightly differently. And those technical capabilities will be ones you'll want to evaluate over time. And the example here is that what we want to be able to do is connect in these different types of software in a basically consistent way, right? So this is yet another example of connectivity, and you're going to see a lot of innovation from us in the idea and the premise of connecting different types of data intelligence software into the central platform that we're developing. And ultimately, this is what it might look like. If you think of a data catalog page, what you want is all of the things that are intelligent about your business, all of the things that are intelligent about your data to be accessible from a single place. It doesn't mean that all of these are going to be one single box with one bit of software all delivered in a single platform. What it means is that you can access the various components that help you learn about your data from a single place, from a single pane of glass, and learn about your data and learn about, therefore, your business from a single pane of glass. And that's what you're trying to do, essentially, with this software category. You're trying to enable people to learn and access information and contextualize it from a single place. So that was one part of the argument, but I would say the better and the bigger part of this argument is that it needs to be engaged and adopted by everyone. Now, when I started this company, I started from Oracle. And so I was at Oracle for about a decade, and I learned a million great lessons about how to build software and how to partner with enterprises. And there were lots of great, phenomenal things about doing that experience and building a software company, because you obviously learn a lot about software from one of the major software houses in the world. But what you also learned is they sold a lot of shelfware. And a lot of people would buy software and they would never use it. And you'd buy licenses that would never get deployed. And you would get software that checked the box in the RFP, but nobody ever rolled out the functionality. And one of the things that I promised myself that I would do in building a company is to basically build something that people actually used, right? Horrible to wake up every single day and to be able to say, like, oh, we motivated this team to build all this software, and exactly one person uses it in the galaxy, right? That's kind of the curse of enterprise software. And so when we talk about our values within the company, and I'll share them in just a second, one of our values, one of the 4 values, is to measure ourselves through customer impact. And so this is an example with Genius Sports. And Genius basically had a compliance-oriented agenda when they were purchasing Alation. They wanted to comply with data privacy laws, GDPR being perhaps the most salient of them. And they needed to tag a whole bunch of bits of information. And they were able to do that super quickly by deploying Alation. That's a success story for us, because it allows customers to do otherwise more scalably what they would have done much more slowly and manually. Munich Reinsurance is another great customer in Europe, somebody who's been with Alation for now about 8 years. And Munich Re now has scaled to about 2,000 actuaries. And within days of using Alation, we're able to discover cost savings. Within months of using Alation, we're actually developed new insurance products for windmill farm reinsurance, which is something that they'd tried to do for about 2 decades prior to having Alation, but were only able to do because they were able to give their teams the context for how to use the data and to where to use the data, and to connect each other with the data. And finally, Pfizer, which might be one of my favorite case studies, because not only was Alation used in the development of COVID-19 therapies, but it was also used in the context of being able to develop drugs for cardiomyopathy. And so there's a lot of interesting case studies for both drug development and drug deployment that we've been able to see from Pfizer and many of our other pharmaceutical clients. And so what we're then therefore investing in is this idea of basically broadening engagement and adoption, right? If you want to build software that people are going to use, then what you need to do is build software that immediately solves problems for what people are trying to do every single day. People are not just going to come to Alation because somebody, admonishes them and says, look, you've got to be more curious and rational. Like, that's not a thing. Nobody actually cares about that in the abstract. What people want you to do is to make their lives better, right? To allow you to have tools that allow them to do their jobs much more quickly, much more efficiently, and much more easily. And so where we're investing is, one, into moving in the cloud, because in the cloud, we're going to be able to see a lot less friction in using the software than we otherwise might. It's more reliable, it's more secure, it's much more robust, it's much more performant. But what we're also going to be able to see is a lot more in the way of new product offerings. And one that's coming out that's particularly exciting in Q4 will literally 10x the audience of people who could and ought to access Alation than what might be available today. And so there's so much more innovation from our perspective, but a lot of that is not just about necessarily gathering more information. It's about actually getting it to be disseminated to many more people over much more time. So we are, if nothing else, a values-driven organization. I hope that, certainly by featuring Tim, and certainly through listening to our talk, and most critically by interacting with so many of the people that are here today from Alation, you would get that sense. But our 4 values are to build for the long term, to move the ball, to listen like you're wrong, and to certainly measure ourselves through customer impact. And I would encourage you to take those values, and you certainly have your own organizational values, but try to take those same values as you think about deploying Alation to many of your underlying stakeholders. Because ultimately, you want to build a long-term capability, but between now and that ultimate long-term state, you want to be able to make quick progress. And that's one of the things that we pride ourselves on doing, and I think we encourage many of our customers to do. Over time, you've got to think about your own cognitive biases and listen like you're wrong, which is really hard to do, because ultimately, these initiatives take a lot of twists and turns, and they don't always go in a linear fashion like you might expect. And finally, think about in which ways you're going to measure these initiatives, because as you invest in, whether it's data governance or data cataloging, these things can be pretty hard to figure out whether you're successful or not. So starting with a measure day one and then really driving towards it can be a really impactful way to get to success. And so we are here to support you in that endeavor. We don't just sell software. Certainly the software is the big part of what we do, and we do very much think of ourselves as a product company. But Dean Thomas, who's all the way in the back corner, is going to be leading a session this afternoon in one of the breakouts. And he's going to talk to you about how we engage with customers and what are the successful patterns that we see with customers. But there's any model that might help you in order to be able to address some of your needs. Sometimes there's a technical problem. You may need to deal with our technical support function. Sometimes you might want to self-serve and go to our community. But there are different deployment models for us to be able to help you get from the point of buying software to a point where you are ultimately successful in the near term and then, of course, in the long term. So I guess I'm going to end by basically saying thank you to all of you for being here today. To me, this is very much a journey, and to me, this is very much a partnership. We're trying to, with this context, build a community, and it's pretty gratifying because I remember the last time that we did revAlation, we had a room that was maybe about a third this size, and so it's pretty exciting to be able to see this many folks in a room who are interested, and I can imagine that in a year you'd see this exact same room, and it would likely be 3 times the size that it might be today, train strikes not permitting. And so thank you for taking the time. I'm going to be here at the breaks, but I'd really encourage you to use this day not just to listen to the content in the presentations, but also to engage with many of the folks who've either been on the path or many of our partners who are sort of walking this journey. Because the best part about these events is, 1, by learning and getting the context, but 2, being able to sort of test it in reality by talking to your peers and your colleagues. So thank you for that, and use this day to your advantage. Thank you.